welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Amidst all the talk about climate change and potential apocalyptic prognosis, I think there is value in examining myths and reality about climate science, about today's regulatory framework. What is there a cause to panic? Is the world around about to end? And is what we are doing in any way impactful on this course of events? To discuss this not at all controversial subject, we have Dr. William Happer. He's a Princeton-based physicist and climate scientist, and he's served in the past in the Trump administration and left. And actually, before we get into the subject of the current landscape, I'll ask him a few questions about his background, his interest, and why he left the past administration. Dr. Happer, welcome to the program, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Irina. I'm glad to be with you.
If you could tell us a little bit more about your background and what brought you into the general area of climate science, and then why you ended up in the White House, and also why you left. That would be fantastic.
Well, thank you. I'm a physicist, and I've spent most of my career in the interaction of radiation and matter. You know, I was trained as a nuclear physicist, but, you know, I was looking at a lot of gamma emitting nuclei. And so I was interested in radiation from a young age. And then when the laser revolution started, I got interested in lasers, and so optical and infrared. So I knew a lot about the key physics that is involved in climate, although to describe me as a climate scientist is not really correct. I'm probably best known for inventing what they call the sodium guide star, which is used in most modern observatories, ground-based observatories, to correct for the distorting effects of the atmosphere when you're looking at distant galaxies and other astronomical objects. And so this was something I invented in 1982, just at the beginning of the Strategic Defense Initiative, and it was held very secret for nearly 10 years, but we did a lot of secret work with it during that period, and finally, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was declassified. But partly as a result of that, I spent a fair amount of time in Washington. I was the director of energy research and under Bush Sr., 1990 to 93, approximately. And so I knew a lot about what research was being supported by the federal government, certainly by the Department of Energy, and that included a lot of work on climate. So I knew where the money was going for climate research. And even then, I was a little worried about the amount of money we were putting into computers. I was very happy to put money into instruments to measure important things about the atmosphere, satellites, ground-based instruments, but we were spending a lot of money on computers that seemed to be producing garbage, you know, the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. And that was certainly the case of climate then. Yeah, the computers models were running much too hot even in 1990. They've only gotten worse since then. So there was this break between reality and and what computers predicted. So I came back to Princeton after Gore and Clinton were elected. Gore couldn't wait to fire me. It took him a few months to find where I was, but he eventually found me and fired me, and I was glad to go home. But I had still a research group at Princeton, and they were doing interesting stuff, had nothing to do with climate. So I was distracted working on that for a number of years. But I kept looking at the nightly news and seeing all these crazy pronouncements about, you know, the climate crisis, which I knew weren't true, you know, because I'd supported the work. And so I would get more and more irritated. I would complain to my wife when we were watching the evening news, and she would say, well, if you're so upset, why don't you say something? So finally, I began to speak out a little bit, and it gradually grew to now that I'm retired, I spend most of my time trying to push back against nonsense. You know, every one of us is an environmentalist. You want to live in a clean, beautiful world, and I certainly do, and I'm sure you do. But, you know, the CO2 molecule, which has been so demonized, actually has nothing to do with pollution. It's not a pollutant at all. You and I breathe out CO2. It's coming out of my mouth as I talk to you. Quite a bit, you know, it's roughly 2 pounds a day of CO2 that we emit. You multiply that by 8 billion people, and when people talk about carbon pollution, I think, who are they talking about? Are they talking about me and you? You know, because we emit so much carbon. We're made of carbon after all. So it's become it's hard to describe what it is. For some, it's a kind of a religious cult. You know, many people have lost their traditional religious beliefs. You know, they don't go to church, or they don't go to synagogue, or they don't go wherever, but they need something beyond themselves to make them feel their life is worthwhile. And what greater cause could there be to save the planet? So these poor people are, you know, they have worthy goals, but they've been badly misled. The planet doesn't need saving at all. And in fact, the policies to save it will do enormous harm to the planet and to the people on it. So that's one part of the problem. Another part is that it's become a very profitable enterprise. You know, if you're selling solar panels or sustainable systems of energy, you make a lot of money because customers are forced to buy it from you. It's mandated by the government, and their government subsidies. And so it's extremely profitable to many, many people now. And so they really don't care whether it's true or not. They would like it to continue as long as the money keeps coming in. So that's another part of the problem. And then, of course, politicians have seized on it as a good way to get elected. You know, there are all these true believers out there who will vote for you if you promise them you'll save the planet. So that's the situation as I view it. You asked about my year at the Trump White House. The way that happened was I had a call from the National Security Council, which headed by John Bolton at the time, and they asked if I would come down and help them out on emerging technologies, because, you know, I developed a lot of innovative technologies myself, and, you know, done a startup company, so I knew a lot about that. And I said, well, I'm too busy, you know, pushing back on climate to do that now. And they said, well, you can, if you want to push back from here, you can do that. I mean, as long as you do your other job. And I said, well, okay, you know, I'll come for a year. And if I make any progress on climate, maybe I'll stay longer, but I'm only going to get a 1-year lease, you know, corporate housing, and we'll see what happens. So I did, and they kept their word. John Bolton helped me as much as he could to get Mr. Trump's attention, and we eventually did. And Mr. Trump was interested in pushing back on this. He himself recognized that it was largely a secular religion. It really had nothing to do with the environment or saving the planet. And so my hope was that we could have a really good scientific review of what's really known about climate and what isn't known. And I'd already picked, you know, outstanding people, you know, to run this review. One of them was Steve Koonin, who's a very good climate scientist, a scientist in general, and he had been Obama's Undersecretary of Energy, so it was certainly not a partisan thing. But Mr. Trump's advisors felt that this politically maybe was too dangerous for him, and so they did their best not to have this review. And of course, they control all the bureaucratic levers, and so they were able to delay it for week after week. Even after Mr. Trump had told them to do it, they were able to not do it. If you think people salute and do everything the president says, I can assure you that's not true. It's there really is a deep state, and it's very hard to move the deep state, and the deep state didn't want to do this. And so so toward over 3/4 of my 1 year that I agreed to stay, it was pretty clear that we were not going to do the review. And Mr. Trump called me in and we talked about it, and he said, look, I'm all for this, but let's wait until my second term. And I said, well, thanks, Mr. Trump, but the agreement was that if we did something while I'm here, I will stay and help, but if it's not going to happen, then I'm going back home. I've got other things to do. And so they were quite gracious about it. And so at the end of my year, I didn't renew my lease, and I came back to Princeton. And so here I am.
So help me understand something. This story about climate change in various forms has been ongoing for many decades. It hasn't started yesterday. It hasn't even started under Obama. It started at around 60s that I remember, that I can recall, if not earlier. And at first it was global cooling, then it was called global warming, then it became climate change. And overall, the basic precept was that as a result of dangerous human activity, the world is heading for a disaster, and all life will come to an end. Obviously, that did not happen. Not,
Right.
and
Right.
and obviously
Yeah.
the various efforts to prove that it could happen have not been true. So, but at the same time, there were real climate challenges. The Soviet Union managed to, through very destructive action and pollutants, destroy a lot of very fertile ground in various territories under its control at the time. Those types of malicious and destructive and reckless activity are very real. What is
Yes.
it that forced environmental activists to focus on things that seem to be very difficult, if not impossible, to impact or control by human activity, as opposed to things that are very much controlled by human activities?
Yeah. Yeah, this Danish economist, Bjorn Lomborg, has made this point very forcefully that, whether you believe in the frightening scenarios of climate or not, the way we're spending money is not doing any good. We're wasting money that could be better spent and have, make people's lives much better, but we're squandering it on windmills and solar panels and other stupid things that, in fact, make people's lives worse. And so there's been a tremendous misallocation of resources as a result of this myth, that there is a climate crisis. And you said correctly that, climate is important. It's always changed. And I'm sure you remember that the reason Joseph and his brothers went to Egypt was because there was a long drought in the land of Canaan in Palestine, and they were going to starve to death if they didn't move. And that was a long-term climate change. And there's some evidence from that in proxy records, and that had nothing to do with CO2. And so if you just look at human history, climate has always changed. In general, a cooling has been bad and a warming has been good, so even the sign of the current narrative is not correct. Most coolings have been bad, most warmings have been good. So the whole thing doesn't make any sense. It's but it's very hard to stop it. I don't know how it will be stopped. It doesn't seem possible to stop it on the basis of rational discussions. And it may be necessary for some country or maybe some state to do everything that is demanded by the climate extremists, you know, ban all internal combustion engines, ban meat, you know, all of the things that they're demanding, and just let the rest of the world see what happens. You know, hopefully it will happen in some small political unit so it doesn't cause too much damage. But it may be necessary just to have a horrible experiment so that people can see what will happen if you do everything that is demanded. That sort of happened in Ceylon, you know, 2 or 3 years ago. They had a government that was installed by, you know, Western billionaires, and so they went back to organic farming, no more nitrogen fertilizer, Mother Nature, Gaia, and all that stuff. And the result was that there were massive crop failures. You know, the price of rice went up by so much that poor people couldn't afford to eat anymore. And finally, there were massive riots in Ceylon. The government had to flee on an airplane to Thailand, or otherwise they would have been hung. And it's too bad that he escaped, in my view. But anyway, that may be something like that, but on a more dramatic scale may be necessary. Maybe California will do it. Maybe Germany will do it. I don't know. I feel bad for the people who live there, because it's not everyone in any country that believes in this. Many people realize that it's nonsense, but they don't have the influence to stop it.
So a lot of this seems to be influenced by corporate lobby groups who benefit from these technologies, by academics who receive their funding from particular sources, and anyone who believes that academic funding is completely neutral and agenda-free has clearly never dealt with anything academic. And but there's also seems to be a Malthusian spirit about it, because from going about talking about more diversifying energy and finding cleaner and more efficient forms of energy and fighting excesses of whatever, we suddenly have come to banning things completely in their entirety, not just making things more efficient and clean, but just outright banning. From pushing for electric vehicles, there seems to be now a policy push for no vehicles in certain areas, for curtailing travel altogether, going back to bikes and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Where does it end? At what point do people draw the line and realize that there are people who don't believe that humanity should exist?
Well, as I said, you know, I think it would be good if some state did everything that they demand. Everybody rides a bicycle, nobody can travel. You know, you have to live within 3 miles of your home, and it's a police state. You know, it's 1984, and that's what they're asking for. I mean, there's no point in euphemisms. But practically, you do touch on something that is important, which is that we hope that humanity will be around for a long, long time. And we are using up cheap fossil fuels. I think there's plenty for many, many decades, probably centuries still left, but eventually it will become too expensive. And so it would be a good idea to keep talented people trying to figure out new sources of energy, not for today, but for a century from now, when we will need them. And I would, you know, nuclear power, for example, is one of them. Nuclear fission works fine. You know, many countries in the world run on nuclear power. France, for example, has for many years. China is building nuclear plants as fast as they can. And you can make them safe. You know, if you really look at the record, even with Chernobyl and with Fukushima, far fewer people have died from nuclear plants accidents than from fossil fuels. So if you could figure out a way to really make nuclear safe, and a big part of that is the nasty connection to weapons, that there is this proliferation issue associated with fission power.
Mm-hmm.
But assuming you could solve that, which you might be able to do, that would be one way to go forward. But of course, you can't run your automobile or on nuclear power, and no one has invented a better means of transportation than an internal combustion engine. It's compact, it's efficient, it's convenient. You can fill up a gas tank in 2 or 3 minutes. It takes 2 or 3 hours to charge a battery. And so if you had enough cheap energy, you could make synthetic gasoline. So my guess is that 200 years from now, we'll still be using internal combustion engines, but we'll be using synthetic fuel that we've made out of water and limestone. Limestone is a source of carbon, water for the hydrogen.
Mm-hmm.
And so we will have finally reached the sustainability goal that all of these zealots are clamoring for now, but it will be for economic reasons. And but that's a very distant dream right now, and we have to get through the present in order to get to that point.
I've been looking at reports about the implementation of the so-called alternative or green energies, and
Yeah.
there seems to be a somewhat dishonest way of reporting the growth of these industries with respect to their proportionate to their actual use versus the percentage of growth per year in whatever area. I mean, basically, despite the supposedly rapid accelerated changes in moving forward with all these concepts, in reality they're only a fraction of traditional fossil fuel sources that are used on an everyday basis. So how is it that this information that is packaged in a way that appears to be much more successful than it really is, how has it escaped the attention of the critics, and why hasn't there been more of a push to bring that to the public attention, that they're being misled about the successes in the development of these industries?
Well, the alternative energies, wind power, solar power, have been pushed for political reasons. There was no economic reason that we would ever have done wind power or solar power, except for niche applications. If you happen to live on a little island and it's nice to have some solar panels, you don't have electricity to the mainland. So there are niche applications of these things that do make sense, but not for, supplying a whole country with energy, electrical energy. And the reasons are completely obvious, that the wind doesn't blow all the time, and there are often weeks at a time where you don't get very much wind. And so what are you going to do for power then? So in effect, what you have to do is you have to double the power generation capacity. You put up all these windmills, but then you have to put up natural gas plants to take over when the wind stops blowing. So it doubles the cost of, or more than doubles the cost of the electrical supply system. And there are serious problems with the electrical grid too, that you have to cope with, and it's expensive and makes everything less reliable. So the whole thing is sort of crazy. I mean, think about the steam engine. As soon as the steam engine showed up, within 2 or 3 decades, practically every major shipping company in the world, stopped using sailing ships and put steam engines in the ships. And the sailors used to talk about a fair wind in the forecastle hold. The forecastle hold was where the steam engine was. And nobody wanted to go back to wind for ocean transportation because fossil fuel power was so much better, and it's still better. So there's a reason that we use fossil fuels, and we've already compared it with renewables like wind, and renewables are really lacking. They're a terrible way to try to run civilization. It's just too dispersed, the energy, it's too expensive to get it, and it's not a good way to run a civilization.
Well, for all the talk about decarbonization and net zero and basically electrifying everything and changing everything to the alternative forms of energy, somehow the actual levels of carbon have gone up, and not only have we not been successful, but we managed to actually fail more than succeed in meeting that goal. What accounts for this difference in expectations versus reality? Why is it that not only have we all these efforts to cut down on carbon not succeeded, but they've actually gone the other way in terms of numbers? What explains these trends?
Well, you have to remember that a large fraction of the world has not gone crazy in the same way that United States and Western Europe and United Kingdom have. China's still building coal plants as fast as it can. I'm sure you've been to China. It's a very impressive country. And it's run by engineers who understand, the laws of thermodynamics. And, India is still building coal plants, and they have to. Why shouldn't they have a standard of living that we have here? And the reason we have our standard of living is because of fossil fuels. We didn't have this standard of living 200 years ago. It was the same as in the third world in many ways. So I think it doesn't matter really what Europe or the United States do about so-called carbon pollution, which isn't carbon pollution at all, that the bulk of the world is not going to go with us. And so we're simply wasting money. We're impoverishing our citizens. We're making people more and more skeptical about governments and about science. It's been very bad for science.
Mm-hmm.
If you talk to people now, when I was young, scientists were viewed with some reverence, these dedicated people, trying to get the truth. And now people look at them, as scam artists, send more money to my lab, and so I think it's been very damaging to the image of science. Climate has been one of those, but COVID certainly was very damaging too. If you look at the way that was handled, it was not the best moment for science. So I don't know. I in the end, this will collapse. So the only question is how much damage can be done before the climate madness abates. I don't know. So it's better that it collapse sooner than later, so it does less damage. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned another factor that plays into all of this, and that is very much money. There's been literally trillions of dollars spent on this in the US alone, and I don't even know how much else globally. There is annual events dedicated entirely to all of this. There's been international pledges, and who knows where that money is going. I've spoken to a few countries which were supposed to receive climate change reparations and have yet to receive a penny. So I don't know what happened to all of that funding. I was concerned about the corruption in those countries, but now I'm starting to think that maybe they weren't the problem.
Yeah.
But most of these regulations, the Inflation Reduction Act, ironically named, I wonder who came up with that, and a few various versions of a Green Deal that have been floating around, and associated multi, 1,000-page bills that came to be passed. An average person cannot possibly make sense of all of these things. Even an average lawyer at a community center or
Yeah.
cannot really possibly make sense of all of this. So how do these regulations actually work?
How do what actually work?
These regulations, how do these
Regulations?
frameworks? Yes, I mean, I just see
Well, you know,
billions of dollars spent and with no conceivable way of implementation. How does it actually come from being a piece of paper to, to a physical reenactment?
well, let's take utilities, for example, who used to provide affordable, reliable electricity from coal plants and gas plants. And
Mhm.
now you see many utilities are closing down gas plants and coal plants especially, and contracting for wind power, building offshore wind and big solar fields. And if you really look at it, the reason that's happening is that utilities are regulated companies. They can't charge anything they like. They have to go in front of a political commission, a utility commission, that determines what rates they can charge. So if they close down a inexpensive coal plant that's provided reliable, cheap power and replace it by windmills, which provide very unreliable power, they can increase the cost to the consumer by factors of 2 or 3 or 4. So the consumer pays 3 or 4 times as much as the utility. So the utility makes much more money, by closing down their coal plant and putting up these alternatives than if they try to service their customer base in the most economical and reliable way possible. So it's in the interest of the utility company, and their shareholders to go along with this. And the only people that are hurt are the people who buy the electricity because they pay 3, 4, 5 times as much for electrical power than they should. There's no reason to pay that huge amounts, and it's also very unreliable. If it's a hot summer day, they may shut off your air conditioner because the windmill isn't working.
And to what extent the money that's supposed to be going to all these projects actually goes to these projects? The reason I'm asking this very strange question is I've attended conferences specifically dedicated to the financial incentives related to this sort of climate change infrastructure, and realized that a lot of the money that trickles down from the federal allocation to community centers, there's no real way to implement it there because people don't have the skills, the personnel, the training, the capacity, and sometimes the political will to deal with this. So what happens to that funding? Where does it go? How does it, if there's really no way to kind of spend trillions of dollars, what happens to it?
Well, I'm a physicist, and so I'm a lot more interested in differential equations and instruments than tracing where money goes. But, I don't think I would like to see the result of such a study because, of course, much of it will be going into corruption, much of it will be wasted on silly things that don't make any difference. That's what always happens when you have big government programs, because nobody is watching how the spending is going. So it's really bad for civilized society. A society only works if people think that sort of everyone is getting a fair deal, that somehow society is fair. It may not be perfectly fair, but it's at least not grossly unfair. And we're drifting away from that now because many people can see that there are really two Americas. There's the Americas of the penthouses in New York and Boston and San Francisco, where they sip wine and cheese, and cut deals on offshore solar power and government subsidies. And then there's the America of the barber and the truck driver and the school teacher who has to pay 3 or 4 or 5 times more for electricity and other necessities of life. So it's I think socially very corrosive, and it's going to get worse as time goes on.
All of this is a little bit mysterious to me because, over the decades, these prices have accumulated, the costs have accumulated, the exponential, I would say, and it's becoming more and more obvious that we are not getting the return on that money, not nearly as much as one would expect, given how much is being spent. Now, all of that has turned EPA, a relatively marginal agency, into a powerhouse of bureaucracy. It's you've got climate change czars and all these people who previously would have been marginal figures at best, playing an outsized role in government, and literally every US federal and state initiative has some climate change related component to it, no matter how seemingly incongruous it is to the function of that agency or that particular track. So how is it that the entire US government has been restructured around climate change diplomacy, climate change language? It's one thing to worry about that, even disproportionately to its importance, but whatever. It's one thing to dedicate a lot of money to accomplishing a particular goal, but how has it become the centerpiece of absolutely everything? That to me is kind of really strange. How is it that every national security and white paper on this and that has some climate change related issue to it? Why is it more important than anything else?
Well, governments, they tend to grow, they're sort of like cancers, they metastasize. And, we have this enormous administrative state in America. It's much bigger than it was when I was young. And there are many, many people, and they need something to do. And so take EPA, which you mentioned, the Environmental Protection Agency. I studied them when I was the director of energy research in the early 90s because they were a bit of a problem then. They're much worse now, but they were already a problem. And I remember talking to friends from EPA who were honest people who wanted to serve the American people. And one of them told me that a big part of the problem is the civil service regulations, which determine your salary not by your competence or how much good you do in your job, but by the number of people who work for you. So the incentive in the US government is to expand your office, find some reason to hire new people. And if you do that, you get a bigger salary. And I think that's true in other countries too. And so one thing that would help a lot would be to somehow break that connection between salary and supervision, because it forces agencies to balloon, to get more and more and more people into them. And the laughable Inflation Reduction Act will only make that much worse. And it's like George Orwell's titles. They were just the opposite of what they really did. There was the Ministry of Truth, which was nothing but a propaganda organization. And So I think we do really have a serious problem with the administrative state in this country. Other countries also have it, it's not just the USA, it's a natural human condition. And it's very hard to break that, takes a lot of courage, and lots of people have to take political risks to push back against that. But at some point, if you don't do that, it will correct itself because the whole system will collapse. And one would hope that we've got enough sense that we don't wait until this natural correction takes place, but we correct it ourselves as rational citizens.
I want to ask a little bit of a depressing question on that note, which is the field of science, which, as you've mentioned, has become it has led to a lot of skepticism among the public. What happens to people going into science now? Can they avoid being corrupted or drawn into these entirely politicized academic and other processes? Is it still possible to objectively address some of the important real scientific issues underneath all this political agenda-driven, outcome-focused research, where the results seem to be placed before the actual observation status and scientific methods?
Well, you're touching on a very important point, and that is the research universities. Every little college now aspires to be a research university, which means that they're sucking in funds from the federal government. And so university administrators love that because it gives lots of overhead. They typically take half of the funding that comes from the government for overhead. We certainly do that at Princeton, and most other places do it too. And so there's this pressure to bring in money, in outside grants. And you probably noticed about a month ago that the president of Stanford University resigned. And he was forced to resign because it turned out that his group, I don't know how much he personally was involved, but it was clear that his group was fudging the data, the results. It was clear they didn't reproduce, that they'd been exaggerated, and it really was a scandal, and he was complicit in it. He may not have actually done it, but he certainly made no effort to stop it. And so the people in his group who were promoted, who got tenure, who got big salary raises, were the ones who made all of these falsifications, because it brought in more money, new grants. This was all so exciting. The fact that it was wrong, it didn't matter. It was just exciting. So it's a very bad thing, and people recognize it. As long as external funding is so important to faculty careers, and as long as university administrations are so dependent on that, I don't see how to correct it. And here at Princeton, I look around, we've got an enormous building program going on, and it's all overhead, from much of it from saving the environment, saving the planet. Huge amounts of money have come in, and we've got a lot of overhead for that. So we're building new buildings to get even more overhead coming in. It's a bad situation. It reminds me a little bit about the situation with the Catholic Church in Europe, at the time of the Reformation, 1500 early, it was very corrupt at that time. It's much better now than it used to be. So I don't mean to offend my Catholic friends, but they have to admit that at that time it was profoundly corrupt. And so science is a little bit like that right now. It's being driven by money, and you had these agents wandering around Europe in the 1500s, selling, salvation, you pay this much and you get, this many sins taken care of, and so it wasn't religion at all. It was a scam, and So unfortunately, a lot of science is somewhat similar to that today.
How to restore a sense of humility, wonder, and balance, and not to mention reputation to the science fields affected by this, you know, by these perverse incentives.
Well, you asked me all these very hard questions for a physicist. These are questions about human nature, and atoms and nuclei and lasers are much easier to understand than human nature. And so
But
I
these things that you just mentioned, they used to drive human. There was an excitement to discover something new at one point for the sake of research, for the sake of uh, finding something new, and
yeah,
mutual critique among colleagues was something that was part of the fun of it and part of the
yeah.
challenge. And all of a sudden, it has become something that's almost untouchable.
Well, I don't think I think science will always have a few creative people who will
Mhm.
make new discoveries. I mean, that was the case even before government started funding science. For example, until World War II, there wasn't much money for scientists. If you wanted a career in science, you knew you would never make much money, so you had to do it because you loved chemistry, you loved physics, you loved geology. And people were still willing to take that risk and live a very modest life. They knew they'd never get rich, but the pleasure of finding out how nature works was worth it to them. And many of them were actually independently wealthy. If you look back into the 1800s, at the scientists at that time, it's surprising how many funded themselves. They came from well-to-do families, and they were a little odd, but they had enough money that they could set up their own lab and work in their lab and discover things. And Lord Rayleigh was that way. Charles Darwin was that way. Maxwell was that way. There were a lot of, especially in Great Britain. Germany got an earlier start with government funding. That's a pattern that we adopted in the United States. It was the German university system. So in the late 1800s, the German government, especially the Prussian government, was already supporting research in universities. Not nearly at the extent of today, but certainly more than anybody else in the world at that time. And so we copied that in the United States. The first university to copy the Germans was Johns Hopkins. They were the first graduate school in America. And then there was a lot of controversy in the Ivy League. Should we follow the Germans, or should we continue to be aloof and more like Oxford and Cambridge? But eventually the German model won.
Mhm.
So we all are basically clones of Göttingen and Heidelberg and places like that. Not Oxford and Cambridge. Oxford and Cambridge are also now clones of the
Oh,
German universities.
so that model has been completely.
Well, they need money too.
So you keep, it's one thing to worry about these concerns when there's this influx of money that basically drives drives the direction and defines the directions where science goes. In some respects it's okay, it's natural, and in some instances it's excessive and completely, not appropriate. But at the end of the day, we still have room for innovation, for legitimate progress on various issues. You mentioned lasers. We're having kind of a new laser revolution in the context of this new Cold War that we are facing. How much do you think there is room for this kind of to break down these kind of bureaucratic approaches to science? It kind of bring back, have this resurgence of a really technical, amazing technical breakthrough, the kind that we experienced during the last Cold War, and to what extent do you think this reorientation towards real security concerns, will kill off some of the climate change craze?
Well, climate policy has indirectly, I think, worsened the security situation. If the Germans had not been so dependent on Russian gas, I think that maybe the Ukrainian war would not have started. It's hard to know, in retrospect, but it certainly encouraged Putin and his supporters to think that they would get away with this because the West was so dependent on energy supply from Russia. I mentioned that you have to have natural gas backup for wind power. Germany had all this wind power, and the way they were going to balance it was with Russian gas. So if they had not done that, if they had maintained a more diversified power sector, they would have been much less beholden to the Russians, and the Russians would have felt less confident that the way to solve the Malorossiya problem is just take it by force. A little bit like the Franco-Prussian War. I think that's what they hoped it would be, and it's been a lot harder than that. And but it was driven partly by the silliness over European climate policy. I think that everyone who really seriously looks at it realizes that climate policy made that much worse.
But we are seeing that despite all of these very legitimate observations, Europe is doubling down on a lot of their policies. They're trying to divest a little bit from the Russian, dependency, but they're not necessarily changing the policies themselves. The Germans are not reopening the nuclear plants. The Dutch are not kind of cutting back on the regulation that hinders productivity. We're not seeing that reality is comporting with these needs, partly because the economy in Europe is still relatively good compared to Russia or some other places, and there aren't any food shortages as of yet. Do you think it'll get to that point?
Well, look, I'm not an expert on Europe. But not all European countries are like Germany. Germany, I've always admired the Germans. They do everything with such thoroughness, and competence, and whether it's good or bad, they're just very competent people. But, Sweden has recently decided that they're probably going to add more nuclear power. That's happening in the Netherlands, too. There have been recent referendums in the Netherlands, and probably nuclear power will come back to Holland. And there's enormous dissatisfaction with environmental policy in Holland. I wouldn't be surprised that much of it will be reversed after the next election in the Netherlands. So the United Kingdom, there's tremendous unease in the governing party, especially from the Midlands, up the parts of England that would normally vote Labour have been voting Conservative, but that's going to change if they don't quickly change their net zero policies, which are impoverishing ordinary people. It's making people in London richer and richer, and making people in Northumberland poorer and poorer, right? And Scotland. And so one has to hope, I think as long as these countries remain true democracies, no matter how messy it is, the democratic forces will eventually stop the madness, because it's causing so much economic harm. But that it can still do a lot of damage before that time comes.
Speaking of damage, the one issue that is not really being looked at is the role of foreign propaganda in all this, in fueling climate change hysteria. We have seen that countries with agendas in damaging U.S. economy and damaging U.S. gas export productions, such as China, Russia, and Qatar, have essentially utilized environmental factions to influence policy to have an impact on the Green New Deal and other regulatory proposals. To what extent? But most of it, after a few articles, the investigations into these networks have petered out. Do you think how much impact do you think such foreign-driven, exploitations of greed and incompetence and just ignorant approach to science has had on the actual policy? Is it fair to say? I mean, we've been looking a lot into election meddling, but this is an indirect way of impacting U.S. democracy and policy through these, foreign influence campaigns. How much do you think of it is really behind some of this regulation that we're seeing?
Well, I don't know. I think most of our problems in the United States are our own fault. It's true that Russia and China would love for the U.S. to have difficulties because we're a competitor to them. But they don't need to work very hard to make us do stupid things. We do them on our own. I think there's pretty good evidence, for example, that Russia has been very supportive of, the green movements in Europe and in the United States. So there's fairly, I think, persuasive evidence of that. And China, you have to admire the Chinese. They've taken their people out of poverty really from 50 years ago, and many of them are middle class now. There are lots of prosperous people in China, and that's because of sensible policies of their government. So they've got enormous progress in economic well-being, a lot less progress in terms of personal freedom. Apparently Chinese feel that for now, at least, that's a bargain worth taking.
Even their economy is not doing so well lately because they have actually been going into more authoritarian economic policies as well.
Yeah.
Anti-Western sentiment has not helped. But a lot of this foreign kind of meddling, you mentioned that even without it, we make enough stupid mistakes. One of them is the inability to criticize the direction and to ask questions and to question the science or bad methodology and bad conclusions. And a lot of people who are trying to question this climate science are either dismissed and ignored or outright discredited and have their reputations ruined. Have you faced any difficulties in that realm? And if so, how did you manage to not be taken down by obvious smear campaigns, by the people who don't wish to be questioned?
Well, I mean, you can find lots of smears of me if you look around on the internet. They are organizations that specialize in smearing enemies of the climate establishment, and that never bothered me too much because if someone I respect criticizes me, I take that seriously and I listen to them. But if it's someone that I have contempt for, I don't care what they say. It's there's nothing they can do to me financially that would hurt me. I'm retired. I have secure retirement income. My university so far has been willing to let me speak out, and so I'm sitting in a nice Princeton office, for which I'm very grateful to Princeton University for letting me have. And so I don't know, the old German saying, Mehr Feinde, mehr Ehre. You know, the more enemies, the more honor.
Uh, that is an inspiring thought, but at the same time, how do you bring people to the table to have real discussions of the issues? You mentioned that you were almost able to do that. Uh, you were almost able to do this, to bring this bipartisan commission to light that ultimately did not materialize, but at the very least, there were scientists who were dedicated enough to not see this issue as a matter of partisan causes. Where are they now? Why aren't they speaking more for this sort of a not consensus but dialogue based approach to these sorts of issues?
Well, look, the climate establishment doesn't want a dialogue, and they have many powerful allies, you know, senators, you know, lots of allies in the deep state, you know, and when you're a cabinet secretary, even if you're named by Mr. Trump or some other conservative, you're rapidly captured by your agency, you know, and so within a year or two, it's not clear whether you're working for the president or you're working for the, you know, Environmental Protection Agency or the Interior Department, you know, because there are these enormous organizations which have their independent sources of support. They have key senators and congressmen who support them, who could care less what the president tells them to do. And so as I mentioned before, a big part of the problem is the administrative state, which is benefiting tremendously from the climate scare, you know, and so they're not enthusiastic about having that narrative challenged in any way. You know, if there's really nothing to be frightened about, if there's no crisis, why are we spending all this money and hurting so many ordinary people? So you have to maintain the air of crisis at whatever the cost is. And so that's what they're trying to do. And so they will not agree to a debate. It's too bad, you know, when we had slavery in the United States, there were these famous Lincoln-Douglas debates over slavery. And, I've forgotten, 1850s, thereabouts. And they were very informative, you know, and it helped people to understand what the issues were. And it didn't prevent a civil war. Eventually, it was an issue that had to be resolved by a civil war. And I had ancestors on both sides of that war, so I feel I can look at it objectively. But debating things, you know, just trying to get the truth out of is really very useful. And unless you're trying to maintain a position that you know you can't defend with the truth, and that's the problem with the extreme environmentalists. None of it is true. It's all made up.
But the problem is, how do you convey the simple message? And this is kind of, I want to, you know, bring that to the conclusion to an average person who is bamboozled by mountains of information or disinformation or propaganda, whatever you want to call it, who doesn't have time to study the science behind all of it, to read the studies carefully, to look at the sources of funding for all these studies, and to spend hours comparing and contrasting them to, you know, to something else, and to do all that sort of research. How do you get this message across and raise questions and bring a healthy skepticism into this average discussion, not high level debates among, you know, politicians and intellectuals, but just bring it down to the level of voters?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the way you have to do it is have enough economic distress that the average citizen realizes this can't go on. So, for example, you know, if the price of gasoline goes to $30 a gallon, you know, it doesn't matter to the, you know, the rich people in New York and San Francisco, but it matters to everybody else. or, you know, if you can no longer travel, you know, as an ordinary person because we're saving the planet, you know, we're going to ground all aircraft, you know. And so, of course, us important people, that's okay. We have our private jets and they'll fly us around, but you average guys, forget about your vacation in Florida or the Caribbean or, you know, so it has to reach that stage where people are really hurting and are recognizing the injustice and the fact that it's really an unjust system where there's an elite that is profiting, and then there's everybody else which is paying the price, and that's really what's happening, but it is not obvious yet to the average person. And when it becomes obvious, then things will change.
When does this I'm not entirely sure that regular people alone would be able to change that. The question is, when does this issue start hurting the elites themselves in some way? At what point do the elites start realizing that for them this is an unsustainable? Because every revolution or counter-revolution or any social movement, grassroots movement whatsoever, you have to have buy-in from all levels of the population, even from the wealthy people, even from the privileged elite class. So at what point do our elites start asking themselves basic questions? This is not working even for us. We are losing. How do we get to the point that they themselves, it is no longer in their interest to push this?
Well, you know, I think if enough of the common people are suffering, that will affect the entire society. For example, companies will start losing money because people can't afford to buy anything.
Mm-hmm.
And investors will start losing money, and retirement funds will no longer be able to pay retirement pensions, and the trust funds of wealthy elites will suddenly be worth, you know, 10 cents on the dollar or 5 cents on the dollar because of the massive financial crisis that's been brought about by these crazy policies. So I think, I mean, I hope it doesn't come to that, but that sort of happened in, it sort of happened in Weimar, Germany. You know, there was this massive collapse of the German economy. Everyone suffered, and it was not a good way to end it, you know, because instead of doing something sensible, you know, they elected the Nazis, you know. So this is not a good way to end bad policies. You know, it's much better to do it rationally. But so I hope that, you know, I've always thought Americans had more common sense than you know, Europeans or or maybe not. You know, Chinese have a lot of common sense. Israelis have a lot of common sense, but you know, I don't think Germans have a lot of common sense. Yeah. You know, I have some German ancestors, so but you have to admit that if you look at their history, there's just too much theory and not enough, you know, sort of practical good sense there. And so anyway, I'm trying to say that I'm hoping that our American citizens have enough good common sense that we will fix this with minimum damage to our society.
By the way, your comments inadvertently answered some of the questions I had about your thoughts about Oppenheimer and his approach and that whole thing with Germans and British and theory and practitioners.
Well, what can you, you're sort of, you're at the mercy of your inheritance. You know, we all have slightly different inheritances, and some of it is good and some of it is bad. You have to admit it. That's true for every group. Yeah.
Well, this was fantastic. First of all, I hope it does not get to the point of an actual crash and crisis and horrible depression before people start kind of dialing back the kind of the the rhetoric and the hype over these
Right.
issues, because I don't think so far it's going in a good direction, and it's
Yeah.
going in a very unfree direction with regulatory practices that infringe on basic economic and other freedoms and a basic pursuit of happiness in living a a good lifestyle, and taking advantage of the wonders of progress and human ingenuity. So I
Mhm.
hope instead it will be channeled into something positive, and in a positive way. I think positivity, finding innovative solutions for energy and all these things is much more inspiring than constant fear mongering. People, it's tiresome.
Yes, I agree with you.
But thank you so much for continuing to do the right thing, and kind of defying the odds here and defying the trends, going against the flow, and trying to get people to examine the questions, because this is what science is about. It should be about exploring, about asking questions, about engaging and trying to understand, not just buying into everything you hear just because there's a lot of it.
Well, thank you, Irina. You keep up the good work.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Have
Bye-bye.
a good one.